Welcome to the online version of Session 1, Faith and Science Introduction. The first session in a six-part series called Faith, Science, and Reason, presented under the program called Basic Beginning Apologetic Studies in Catholicism, held at St. Columbkille Parish in Papillion, Nebraska. My name is Father Kevin Vogel, and I will be presenting these sessions with the assistance of Dr. Gintaras Duda, Associate Professor of Physics at Creighton University and a parishioner here at St. Columbkille. The course of these sessions will be presented at the parish over several months, and this session, the first session was given on October 28th, but was not recorded, so this is a separate recording I am doing, so it's just be myself without Dr. Duda doing his sections of the talk. So before we begin the main part of the talk, we always begin everything we do with prayer. And today we're going to use an ancient form of prayer called Lectio Divina, literally divine reading. It's an ancient form of prayer for praying with the scriptures. There's three basic steps for this type of prayer. We begin with asking the Holy Spirit to enlighten us, to be able to understand how it is that God's speaking to us through the scriptures. Then we read the actual passage in a four-part way. First, of course, by literally reading it. Then by spending time meditating upon what is God trying to tell us in the passage, specifically to ourselves. And then we spend some time in speaking to God, responding to Him in prayer. And then finally we let Him speak to us as we wait quietly to hear His answer. And finally at the end, with response to the prayer, we finish with praise and thanksgiving. So let us begin this form of prayer by using the scripture passage from the Gospel for the 31st week in Ordinary Time. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to carry and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honor at banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called Master. You have but one Master, the Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." So we spend some time meditating upon this passage. What is it that God is trying to speak to me at this moment? The phrase that sticks out of my mind at this time is, "Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." This is at the forefront of my mind because humility is an important virtue to keep in mind as we attempt to bring faith and science together. We have to have humility to realize what our own limitations of our understanding is, and also not to have that false humility thinking that we are unable to know as much as God has enabled our minds to know. So let us respond to these words in prayer to our Father. Having told our Father our prayers, our thoughts, our feelings, and desires, we rest in His presence, listening for Him. We conclude our brief time of prayer today with praise and thanksgiving. Let us use the words of the Psalm for the 31st Sunday in Ordinary Time, Psalm 131. In you, Lord, I have found my peace. O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor my eyes haughty. I busy not myself with great things, nor with things too sublime for me. In you, Lord, I have found my peace. Nay, rather I have stilled and quieted my soul like a weaned child. Like a weaned child on its mother's lap, so is my soul within me. In you, Lord, I have found my peace. O Israel, hope in the Lord, both now and forever. In you, Lord, I have found my peace. Even this psalm reminds us about humility as well. Not to be proud, not to go after things too great. And a topic like we're going to be discussing today is not too great for us. So that's why we rely here at the beginning of the grace of the Holy Spirit to be able to lead and guide us in our discussion today. The form of prayer we just used, of course, if you were to do it on your own, it would increase in the length of time, but we keep it short now so that we can move on to the main part of our talk. There may be a variety of reasons why you've decided to listen to this talk and discuss the topic of how science and faith relate to one another. Perhaps you want to be able to express your faith more intelligibly in this very scientific world, to be able to show that faith really has a place still. Maybe there's some fear that our faith can't hold up in light of science. And perhaps, maybe even there's some who are a little bit skeptical about our faith and wonder, can it really be upheld now that we have science? Can we just depend upon science alone? Well, my own background, growing up on a farm, I was very close to nature and the world around us, and I was very interested in how things worked the way they did. And that got me started on studying physics in college. And to me, also having grown up Catholic, I had pretty much the understanding that faith and science work together, and never really thought that the two, could be at odds with one another. But as I continued through and got into, high school and into college, there were questions at times that were brought up, and I couldn't answer them all. And it left a little disquiet within me, wondering what is the truth. I still trusted that probably the limitation was in my own understanding, and probably could be put together if one worked at it hard enough. One could bring science and our faith together. So I think as I continued through college and then discovered my call to the seminary, my continued interest in how to bring faith and science together was all about wanting to know what's the truth. Coming to realize that both science and faith have their limitations because they have something to do with human knowledge. But that truth overall, since it comes from God and He's the source of truth, can never contradict itself. Of course, this is not a view that's held by all people. For example, many scientists. There's some very outspoken scientists who are atheists and say that science has basically shown there is no need for faith, there is no need even for God. For example, we can look at Stephen Hawking, great physicist.
Did the universe need a creator? Not according to the physicist and mathematician Stephen Hawking, who argues that God wasn't necessary for the creation of the world. Professor Hawking claims that the Big Bang theory of creation can now be explained by science alone, without the need to consider some form of divine intervention. Our science correspondent, David Schuckman, explains.
It's the most fundamental and divisive of questions. How did it all begin? Stephen Hawking once said that if we understood the forces driving the universe, we'd know the mind of God. Well, now he thinks God wasn't needed to get the process going. And tonight he read us the key conclusion of his new book.
Because there are laws, such as gravity, the universe can, and will, create itself from nothing. It is not necessary to invoke God to light a blue-touched paper and set the universe going.
According to Stephen Hawking, the latest theory is that our universe is just one of many. The laws of physics must mean that countless other universes were formed before the Big Bang.
Compare that view with that of Pope John Paul II. He said faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. For him there was no reason for faith and reason, faith and science, to be opposed to one another, because by them both we can come to know the truth. Even those skeptical scientists who try to deny the existence of God based upon science can't deny that throughout history people have loved two things. There's been great love of nature, those things that we can see around us, and great love of God and spiritual realities, those things that we can't see as well. These two realities are indeed different from one another. They have different characteristics. Nature is marked by a certain coherence, a certain intelligibility. It can be understood. We're able to understand a certain order, a structure within it. Also, it's contingent. The explanation for itself is not found within itself. Also, it's physical. It's made up of things. It's made up of matter, things that we can see. And when we speak of nature, we speak of this whole interacting. All of the different parts are interrelated to each other. There's cause and effect relationships among them. Spirit, on the other hand, has some of those kind of characteristics, but what really makes spirit what it is intellect, not just intelligibility. Spiritual realities are intelligible, they can be understood, but things that have a spiritual side actually are the ones that can understand. Thus, human beings are spiritual creatures because we have the ability to understand. Also, the ability to have will, the ability to determine, to love. Also, because it has intellect and will, you can see that it transcends what nature can do. And for that reason, spirit also governs nature. And finally, characteristic of spirit is that it's personal. Because it has intellect and will and can govern itself, it is personal. It can direct itself and shape itself because of its interiority that it has. So these two loves are different, but yet connected in some ways. Whenever we have something that we love, we want to know more about it. When you love someone, you want to know more about them. Same thing about the love of nature and the love of spiritual realities, the love of God. And we could imagine that in order to know these loves, we would know them in different ways. And indeed we do. Two main ways of knowing these two different types of loves, as we can know nature through science, and we can know God and spiritual realities through faith. And the question comes up, well, which one do we choose? Which of these two loves do we go with? Science or faith? Of course, we're here because the only choice that will satisfy us is both. We don't want to choose one or the other. And it should be no surprise to us that we desire both, because faith and science meet each other. Nature and spirit, faith and science meet. And the place where they meet is in the human person, because we are both natural physical creatures and we're also spiritual creatures. So we ourselves are found at the crossroads of nature and spirit, of science and faith that we're going to be discussing. And even more important is the single person who tells us, who helps us understand who it is that we are. And for us as Catholics, and actually for everyone, that is Jesus Christ. He is the one who stands at the crossroads of science and faith. And he will be in the background, if not in the foreground, through much of our discussion in these coming sessions. In order to properly relate natural science and supernatural faith, we first have to know what they are. So we will begin by discussing what natural science is. Natural or empirical science, empirical refers to the fact that it's something we can see, we can physically observe and quantify. When we first think of science, probably the first thing we think of is the scientific method. We learn that in grade school, and we learn the steps of the scientific method. And it really characterizes what science is. In general, you begin with initial observations that you make about the world, which lead you to these initial questions about why it is the way it is. And then you look more into it, do some research, some background research, so that you know enough to be able to make a hypothesis, to form a question about something, predict that a certain cause was going to bring about another effect. And then you test that hypothesis. And there's several methods in which we can test a hypothesis. Testing the hypothesis really forms kind of the central part of the scientific method, and what much time and effort is spent on is the testing of the hypothesis. At this point, you can either find that the hypothesis is true, or you can find it's false. And if you find it false, it may cause you to have to change your experiment, change the set of experiments to do something else, revise your hypothesis, come up with a different hypothesis. Eventually, you come to a point where you have a conclusion of that set of experiments or whatever you're doing, and then you relate that conclusion to other people. You report it to them so that they can benefit from your results, as well as also add to yours, show that you have indeed done the experiment correctly, to kind of verify your results. Here's another diagram giving the scientific method, and you can see that dynamic of whether or not your hypothesis was true, of having to go construct the hypothesis again. But you see in the middle, the green bubble is the test with an experiment. Experiments is one version of testing a hypothesis. There's several methods, but experimental methods is probably the one that we most think of when we think of science. So for example, we see the picture on the right here. There's an experiment set up where an animal and a burning candle is placed inside an airtight container, and after a while the flame goes out and the animal dies. So something about the air is destroyed by the presence of the candle, to the point, and the animal. Something is not there when it was first put in. This set of experiments we see here was put together by scientist Priestley, who actually, through these, discovered the presence of oxygen. In the second set of experiments, we see the placement of a plant in the same apparatus, and this time the flame does not go out and the animal does not die. So something about the plant brings to that situation something that wasn't there with just a candle and the animal. So you can see kind of the flow of these experiments. You have this multiple sets of experiments trying to focus in on what's going on in that situation, eliminating false confirmations of a hypothesis or false disconfirmations of the hypothesis. And the whole flow goes from something that's happening in the present to an effect that happens in the future. And that's kind of the timeline of the way that experimental methods go. It's always testing something in the present and to figure out what future result will occur because of those. Another method is the historical method of testing a hypothesis. In this, you get a set of hypotheses and you're trying to find which one of those sets is the best explanation. So in the picture we have here from evolutionary biology, these are phylogenies trying to take instances of animals or fossils that we have present today and trying to show their relationships. Do they have certain common ancestors? And how do they fit in with these ancestors using the kind of physical structures of the animals we see today? So A and B, you have different animals related to in different ways. And so you get a whole set of these kind of possible hypotheses, and you kind of look and you choose which one is the best explanation. Of course, there's certain limitations with this kind of method, as there was with experimental method. In this case, I mean, perhaps there'll be other animals that you want to add into their other findings, and that will cause you to change how you set up that structure of relationship going back, and you might come up with a better one than you currently have now. But that's one of its limitations, and you see that it has a different kind of structure in the way that it tests a hypothesis, because in this case you're taking an effect that's present now and you're trying to figure out what was the cause in the past that made it that way. So the difference between experimental method and historical method is which way are you trying to go? Are you trying to go from present to future or from present to past? But both are equally valid means of doing science, testing the hypothesis. When we do science, we can speak of 4 different levels of information that we get. And it's important to kind of understand the relationship between these, because sometimes people will get caught up on certain words that we use in the scientific area, like law or theory or hypothesis, and people will sometimes say, well, that's just a theory, and so we don't have to pay too much attention to it. Well, that's sort of a misunderstanding of what the word theory actually means. So the first level of scientific information is just the plain observation of something happens. For example, here something falls. And then you take this observation and you try to quantify it in some way. For example, maybe you're trying to figure out how long does it take to fall? And how fast does it fall? How does it speed up as it's falling? So you're quantifying it through numbers. And then you take these numbers and you've gathered this quantified data from different things, and you say, all right, what's the pattern that we see here in all these numbers? And you put together a law based upon all of these patterns. For example, here's the law of gravity. And then you can take laws and observations and you put them together, and you want to be able to explain a great many kind of phenomena all at once in a kind of conceptual framework. And that's what a theory is. So a theory contains laws and quantified data and other observations, contains all of that within it. And so a theory does not mean that it's just something that's unproven and it's waiting to become a law. No, it's a larger framework than the law. So it's just important to know the difference between those kind of words. So just because something's called a theory doesn't mean that it's some way inferior to something that we would call law in science. Now, when we started in on science, because science is a main method that's used to study nature, to study the material world. And it's a method that only studies the material world. It doesn't look at anything non-physical. It can't appeal to them, including non-physical causes like God. That's why, as a scientist, you should never stop and say, well, God did that. Well, certainly, as Catholics, we believe that God has a hand in the way the physical world works, but we don't do that as scientists. It's a method called methodological materialism or methodological naturalism. So by the very method, we choose only to look at what's material, and we don't pay attention to whether or not there's anything spiritual going on. Now, sometimes scientists will take that too far, and they'll actually rely on false forms of this naturalism. The first one, epistemological naturalism. Epistemology refers to knowing. So in this form of naturalism, the person will say, well, the human mind is only able to know what's physical. So if there's anything else besides what's physical, we can't know it. So therefore, we never really have to try to understand if there is, because it's not possible for us to know it. Of course, and then some will take it a step further to ontological naturalism, which is the claim that nothing else exists except for what's physical. Now, when you look at these, we have to realize neither of these two, epistemological naturalism or ontological naturalism, neither of them are scientific conclusions. They're not, because science is based upon a method by which it doesn't even look beyond what's physical. So how can it say that we can't know anything besides what's physical? How can we say that nothing else exists besides what's physical? To say something like that would be to say something like what Edward Lear wrote, that it is like arguing that since metal detectors have far greater success in finding coins in more places than any other method, metal detectors show that only coins exist. Well, that's absolutely absurd, right? But that's kind of what those kind of scientists would say, that since science shows to have great success in explaining our physical world, it proves that only the physical world exists. Well, that doesn't follow. It's not science, and it's something called scientism. Scientism is basically a belief, an ideology, that only science can reveal the truth. But in and of itself, it's not science. They didn't use science to prove it. And it's not needed to do science. There are plenty of scientists who do indeed believe in the existence of spiritual realities, that do indeed believe in God. So it's not at all needed to be able to do the scientific method. It's not needed to be to follow methodological naturalism. But even more important, scientism is logically incoherent. They can't prove it scientifically, because if science says we only look at what is physical, it can't in any way prove that only that physical thing exists, because it doesn't even look to see if there are anything else. So whenever someone comes with these claims about how science disproves the existence of spiritual realities or of God, we can right away be confident that no, they have a false belief. Their idea is scientism, not science. And we can correct them on it. They may or may not accept, but we should be confident that what they say, we need not accept as truth. Now that we've discussed what natural science is, we turn to supernatural faith, the method of knowing spiritual realities. So To give a definition that we find in the Catechism, faith is a personal adherence of man to God, a free assent to the whole truth that God has revealed. So faith, different from science, is a very personal thing. It's a way in which we're in relationship with God, the way in which we, first of all, trust God, and trust all of those things that He's revealed to us to be true. Since it first comes from God, because He has to reveal those things to us before we can have faith in them, it begins as a gift from Him, a gift from God. But at the same time, it's also our own action, our own believing. So it's a human action as well. It has a part that comes from God and a part from us. Why do we need faith for spiritual realities like God? Well, because those kind of realities and God Himself is hidden. He Himself is infinite spirit. And because He's infinite spirit, He's mystery. We can know something about Him, but we can't know everything about Him. So we need faith in order to know, to believe what He tells us is true about Him is true. Secondly, God's hiddenness allows for us to be free to love Him. If He were so obvious to us that it would almost force us to know Him and to know that He's here, then it would, in a sense, take away our freedom to love Him. Love requires freedom. You can't force someone else to love you. Thirdly, God's hidden. We don't see Him because of our sin. Sin blinds our ability to understand, our ability to see those spiritual realities. And thus, we need that gift from Him, the gift of faith, to believe in Him and to lead us to salvation. But when we're talking about faith, the faith that we have is not faith alone. Faith requires us to use our human intellect, requires us to think. Our intellect is something good. It was created by God. And though it's finite and fallen and limited in that way, it's still usable. But because it's limited, we need the faith as well. Thus, our belief in God is not at all irrational, because we believe because God reveals. See, that's a big difference between faith and science. In science, we believe through our own abilities, through what we see, through observations. But in faith, we believe because of the person of God Himself has revealed it to us. And since He is infinitely good and cannot deceive or be deceived, that faith is not irrational, but super-rational. It builds upon and goes higher than what our reason alone can do. Thus, we don't want a faith that's blind. St. Anselm instead calls it a faith that seeks understanding. Loving God should create in us that desire to know Him better. And vice versa. The more we know about Him, the more we can love Him. As St. Augustine says, I believe in order to understand, and I understand in order to believe. The question can come up, which one is more certain, faith or science? Well, there's some similarities and differences, and there's limitations in both. Science, you know something's visible. You're knowing something that's visible. On faith, you're trying to know something that's hidden. So, based upon that, one might think that science is much more certain, because you can actually see what it is that you're trying to know. You can be in closer contact to it, so it seems. But we have to realize that science and faith, insofar as their human actions, are limited by our own intellect. So in science, which is totally based upon our own intellect, it's very limited in that way. But when it comes to faith, We believe not because of us, but because God is the one who's revealing. And since it comes from God in that way, and he is not limited in what he knows and what he can reveal, in that way faith actually is more certain. It's founded on his word, and it's more certain than any kind of human knowledge that we can come up with. At this point, I want to pause for any questions that people may have. Those of you who are listening to this online, you can still have an opportunity to ask questions on the web page entitled Contact. There is a web form that you can fill out and ask questions, and that'll send it to myself and Dr. Duda, and we will be able to look at that, and then we'll post answers back online under the session headings for whichever session your question refers to. So you may want to check, if you have some questions, you can check under those session headings to see if any of the questions you may have already been answered. Otherwise, feel free to fill out that form and ask us a question. Having discussed individually what both science and faith are, now we can begin to bring them together. We begin to do this by referring back to both the First Vatican Council and the Second Vatican Council, and as they're reiterated in the Catechism, that truth, no matter where it comes from, all comes from God. So truth from our own reason and truth from faith can never contradict itself. We have to have confidence in this when we attempt to bring the two together. So what is the Church's interest in science? First of all, it doesn't make scientific conclusions. Sure, it upholds scientific study as being good, and it supports it. As you can see, there's a picture of the Vatican Observatory. And there's been many scientists who have been priests as well, as we'll see in our next session. But the Church itself doesn't actually make proclamations on scientific conclusions. It leaves that to the realm of the scientists. But it's specifically interested in science because science does help us to understand our world better and who we are as human persons. Remember, we as human persons are the crossroads where spirit and nature, science and faith cross. And then finally, very importantly, the Church will defend its teaching when scientists tend to overstep their bounds of their own methods and make claims that are claims about the spiritual world and about God. For example, one of those is our belief in creation. We can see in our creed, and here I have the new translation that we're going to be using at Mass of the Nicene Creed. Notice how it says, we believe that God is maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. This is different from the previous translation, which was said seen and unseen. You can see visible and invisible really more properly shows what we're speaking about. Because we're not just saying that God made the things that we can see that are right in front of us, and then he made those other things, maybe like across the street there's some car parked over there that we don't see right now, but we could see it if we were over there. No, we're saying he made the things that are visible and invisible, meaning that there are some things that he made that are invisible. There's both nature and spirit. And that's part of our faith. We have to believe it. In fact, belief in creation, that God created everything that exists, is foundational for everything else that we teach about our faith. So, Cardinal Ratzinger, and now Benedict XVI, said that we can't conceal this belief in our faith in creation. Sometimes there's a tendency to downplay that we believe in creation because it can get a bad name, like creationists who try to hold to a very literal interpretation of Scripture, and it seems like they're scientifically untenable. And it can seem like, well, this holding a belief in creation, is that illogical? Is it irrational? But no, definitely is not. And so we should not be afraid to conceal our faith in creation. And that's part of the reason why we have these sessions, is so that we can with confidence uphold and say why we believe in creation and how it still fits with the scientific knowledge that we have now. So how then can faith and science be related? If we're confident that they can be, how then should they be related? Well, there's different ways in which people have tried to relate them. Conflict, separation, fusion, or dialogue and interaction. The first one, conflict, is having to choose one or the other, so either science or religion. And that includes the scientism that we talked about earlier, that says, no, only science is the only way to know something. But it really is a kind of pseudo-religion when you do that. On the other side, you can have religionism, which is kind of what creation science kind of is. It rejects science in the name of faith. And it becomes a kind of pseudo-science. It tries, but faith really can't do what science does. It can't do that same work. As we showed, it has different methods. The second way in which they could be related is separation. That would be to take science and religion and totally put them at opposite ends so they could never meet. That would be kind of the idea of we can only know that which is physical. So we have to use a certain language for science and a certain language for religion, and they never should meet, ever. Of course, that shouldn't satisfy us either. What about fusion? And that means science and faith really becoming one thing, and one thing, something other than what they are. But that also has a problem, because you're not allowing science and faith to be what they are. See, as we were talking about them, we found that they're distinct, and by putting them together so that they just become one thing, you kind of destroy both of them. Instead, we're seeking what John Paul II called a dialogue and interaction, where we're unifying them, but they also retain their distinctiveness. So how do we do this? Well, there's 4 principles that kind of come from John Paul II's thinking that will help us to properly relate them as a dialogue and interaction. The first one is to distinguish in order to unite, then to recognize the blessings that come to us from unifying the two, and then notice what the key link is between science and faith. And then also to recognize that we ourselves, as man, are the key at the center of the two. So we look at those 4. First, distinguish to unite. We have to uphold, we don't want religion and science to become the same thing. They have different methods, as we showed, and they're not to be broken. Instead, there should be a critical openness, a dynamic interchange, as the Pope has said. We don't have to read this entire quote, but this is John Paul II again saying that we don't want them to be the same thing. We don't want an identity between the two, but we want them to be unified while still retaining, still being what they are. It's kind of like marriage. When husband and wife come together, they're a unity. They're, in a sense, one person. But becoming one person in marriage does not mean literally physically that they're now only one mind there. There's only one body there. But they come together, but they still retain their own personhood. They're still the same person, though they aren't unified. So in a similar sense, you could think of faith and science coming together in that kind of way as well. The second aspect to look at is to notice the blessings that really do come from a unity. John Paul II said that science can purify religion from error and superstition, and religion can purify science from adultery and false absolutes. So science can prevent religion from having that tendency to turn itself into science and instead of be properly what it is meant to be. In the same way, religion can keep scientists from those false understandings that science is the only way to know something, or from turning physical things into God. Third, Pope John Paul II noticed that we do have a key link between science and faith that's required for us to bring them together. He says, often beyond two partial and contrasting perceptions, there exists a wider perception that includes them and goes beyond both of them. So in order to bring those two together, we need a wider perception. So what is this wider perception? Well, consider this. You have supernatural faith, which we know theology, things about God, things about spiritual realities. So faith, we know this body of knowledge. And then over on the other side, we have natural science, which we know nature. And from the way it looks is they don't overlap. Well, we need a wider perception. What is it? Well, it's reason. Our capabilities of knowing things about the world and about both nature and spirit are much expand, and they actually overlap. So we can actually know things about our physical world through our reason, but it not being necessarily scientific way of knowing it. We do that all the time. Not everything that we know have we learned scientifically. And also about our faith. We can actually know some things about spiritual realities without faith, but through our reason. For example, one can know that God exists just by reason and without faith. Of course, we can't know everything about what kind of God exists. We can't know things like the Trinity. We can't know that Jesus is God. So what reason can do in that area is quite small, and that's why there's a very small overlap between the two. But reason can know something, even without the help of faith, though it's very, very limited. And that's why Pope Benedict says, though science sees part of the truth, it doesn't see everything. And in that way, we don't want to just limit ourselves to science in some kind of false humility, but we're really fighting to expand reason. And finally, the fourth thing to note is man is the key. He is the one who sits at the crossroads of nature and spirit. And through science, we have come to understand more about who we are. And the Pope says that we've actually come to a new understanding of the transcendence of man's spirit. Because, of course, it's through our spirit that we can know our intelligible world in the first place. Finding the proper relationship between science and faith, between spirit and nature, is not just a good thing for us to do, but, in fact, it takes part in a very central aspect of our Catholic faith. Our whole Catholic worldview depends upon the fact that nature and spirit overlap, that what's visible can tell us something about the invisible. That's what our whole sacramental system is based upon, and the idea of sacramentality in general. For us, spirit and nature are not two totally separate things, but they overlap. The visible tells us about the invisible. Aquinas spoke of it in a way saying that grace builds upon nature. Our whole understanding of salvation is God taking us and transforming us to the power of His grace. And God's mystery is revealed to us through the sacraments, especially the 7 sacraments. This is something Father Michael Himes says is probably unique to Catholicism. I mean, even though other Christian religions share with us the understanding of Jesus and God becoming man, so coming into the natural order, that connection, we have the deepest understanding of how God's grace really does come to build upon nature. that God works with the physical part that he has used to build it up. So Father Himes has a definition here of the Sacramental Principle, which he defines, is that which is always and everywhere the case must be noticed, accepted, and celebrated somewhere, sometime. It's kind of an enigmatic definition, so I'll have to unpack a little bit of that. So the first part, always and everywhere. So what is always and everywhere? Well, everything we see around us it's there and it's all around us. And just by looking at it, and if we spend some time thinking, we can ask the question, well, why is it there? Why is there something here at all? I mean, there could be nothing. Well, the Catholic answer, of course, is creation exists because God willed it into existence. He loved it into existence. God is totally self-giving, endless love. And his love is so great that it flows out from within the Trinity and brings creation into existence. So all things that exist are perfectly loved by God and thus made to exist. So you are perfectly loved by God, and therefore you exist. And so does your chair. Your chair is perfectly loved by God. Of course, the difference between you and your chair is that you can love God back, and you can know God loves you, whereas the chair doesn't know it's loved, and nor can it love it back. Also, the saints, like Mary, are loved, of course, and they do a really good job of loving God back. But even Satan is loved. But of course, he absolutely refuses to love back. One can ask, well, what about people in hell? Well, Aquinas says yes. God's love is keeping those people in hell in existence. Everything that exists is loved into existence by God's love. So, in terms of sacraments, we can speak of sacraments in a very general sense, as separate from the seven sacraments specifically. In the most general sense, anything at all, any person, place, thing, anything, can reveal the fact that it's being kept into existence by God's love. The seven sacraments are specific signs of that. And in fact, they make God's salvific grace, his divine life, present in a specific way that can bring about changes within us in ways that a sacrament in general doesn't have the specific power to do. Well, what does this discussion about sacraments have to do with science and reason? Well, if you look at the definition of sacraments in general, the first part, any person, place, thing, etc., those are all things that science and reason can study. They're in our observable world. And the second part, noticing the love that's behind them and keeping them in existence, that's something we can only know through faith. So you see how in a sacrament, the physical aspect, which science and reason can look at, is being combined with the spiritual aspect, that which faith can know. So if you think about it, whenever we're learning about anything, whenever we are in school learning about any subject whatsoever, it actually is in a sense training us in what one could call sacramental beholding, helping us to learn that all of this exists because God has brought it into existence. And it's helping us to understand that aspect. That's how we really should do education as Catholics. Here's an interesting aspect of that is thinking about what asceticism is. Many people think, asceticism has to do with, self-denial and maybe, hurting oneself through different penitential acts. Well, Baron Friedrich von Hugel thinks about asceticism in a slightly different way. thinking about, well, it's really a renunciation of worldly pleasures, but not by doing any of those things that we think of, but by seeing what actually exists rather than what we want to see. So it's kind of it's in a sense a mental renunciation. So he pointed out that perhaps one of the most ascetic persons was Charles Darwin, because he was able to renounce what he wanted to see and look at lowly animals to discover things about how God created the world. Very interesting thought. Father Himes says, if one sees what is there to be seen, one will discover grace, the love that undergirds all that exists. The ascetic beholds the omnipresence of grace. So, why are we as Catholics concerned about teaching and learning about the sciences? Well, really, it is a Catholic kind of thing. Not, of course, every Catholic must be teachers or scientists, but it fits right in with our Catholic understanding. That one who restrains and submits to learning about the creation God has made actually helps us to cultivate deeper faith. At this point, we'd pause again for questions, and I'll remind you again that you can go to the online form to submit any questions at my website. Here is the web address in case someone is accessing this from a place other than my website. But if we continue on to our final point I want to make in this presentation before we finish, I want to bring up 3 rules or 3 virtues that are really essential to this work that we're going to be doing through these sessions of relating science and faith together. 3 rules are from Pope John Paul II, and the virtues that kind of parallel these rules are from Archbishop Ravasi, head of the Pontifical Council for Culture. The first one, John Paul describes as human knowledge is a journey that knows no rest. And the virtue that parallels that is research, that, our knowledge, we will continue to know more and may never satisfy fully our desire to know. So we will continue to always have to do research to learn more in all of the areas, in the sciences, in theologies, in theology, to try to bring them together. Secondly, the Pope warns against pride, and Ravasi calls for the virtue of humility. It's very important to know our own limitations, to know the limitations of the methods of the way we know things, so that we submit to the way the world is rather than try to decide the way the world should be for ourselves. And finally, the Pope calls for a fear of God, to know that God is behind everything. He's behind all truth. And knowing that should give us great optimism that we can bring faith and science together through reason. In the Catechism, we find this quote which really brings these 3 virtues together. The humble and persevering investigator of the secrets of nature is being led, as it were, by the hand of God in spite of himself. For it is God, the conserver of all things, who made them what they are. So let us keep these 3 virtues in mind as we continue our journey through the next 5 sessions. Our next session, which will be held December 2nd, will be on the history of the interaction between the Church and science. And I look forward to having all of you participate that can, and also those who are able to participate through this online medium as well. Thank you.